Hey, how's it going, everybody? This is Awais back with another video on the channel. Today we're going to be learning Feathers. Feathers is a Node.js framework for building real-time applications or REST APIs. I really like this framework because it helps you to build APIs real fast. So if you're interested in building APIs in very less time, in a day or two, this is a great framework. It comes with authentication out of the box. It comes with some really good services and database adapters that you can use. We're going to be using Feathers CLI to create an application, and I'll show you how Feathers CLI can help you to build services, hooks, and various other things. You have two options. Either you can use TypeScript or JavaScript. I'll be using TypeScript. If you want to use JavaScript, then you can use that as well. So without further ado, let's get started. First, we need to create Feathers application. If you go to Getting Started and click on Generate an App, here you will see a command npm install at feathers/cli-g. That's a command to install Feathers CLI. So we'll go to VS Code, and I'm in the container where I have installed Node.js. So check is a Node version. I've got that. Then I'm going to be using this command to install Feathers CLI. This CLI is one of the best CLI that I've ever come across. It basically asks you a lot of configuration, including your database adapter, including authentication. So we'll just wait for this to complete. We're going to be using Feathers command, generate. Now it gives you two options if you want to select JavaScript or TypeScript. I'll be using TypeScript, enter, and I'm going to name the project Feathers-tutorial. Then for description, I'll just say Feathers tutorial for YouTube, enter. It asking you for your source files, and we'll just leave that as source. Then it's going to ask you what package manager you're going to use. So we'll use npm. You can go with yarn as well. Now here's a cool option. It is asking you what type of APIs you're making. Is it just REST API or is it real-time via socket.io? So what you need to do is go and select by pressing spacebar. So I'll use REST and then real-time via socket.io. Press enter. It's asking for your testing framework. I'll be using Mocha plus Azure. And then authentication. Writing authentication is pretty tedious, and not many frameworks really ask you, hey, do you want to enable authentication by default? Well, I'll be using authentication, so I'll press Y, enter. Now it's going to ask you what type of authentication. Well, we're going to need a local, so you can use username plus password. I'll press spacebar to select that, but you can also go with OAuth 2 or Google, GitHub. I'll be using GitHub as well. Maybe I won't show you in the tutorial, but you can follow along when I use the authentication. Press enter, and it's going to ask you what is the name of user entity. You can actually modify that. I'll leave that as users. It's asking you what kind of service it is and what type of database you want to use. You can go with any DB, MongoDB or Mongoose, SQLize, or in-memory. I'll be using Mongoose because that's what I'm more comfortable with, but this AnyDB is as good as Mongoose as well for development purposes. So I'll be using Mongoose, and it's going to ask you where is your database connection. So in this case, I'm going to open Docker. And Docker, I want to make sure I have the MongoDB running. So we'll go to containers, and I've got this Mongo latest. I click on play, and it's going to start playing that. So I've got this MongoDB latest running. So what I'll do is I will use this MongoDB and then 192.168.1.7.27017, and then the database name will just say Feathers tutorial. Okay, now the reason why I've used this IP address because I'm in a container. I'm not directly installing either CLI or writing this application in my Mac file system. I'm in actually a container. So I'll just press enter and it's going to generate an application for us. Next thing, I'm going to take you to documentation. Once you generate your application by following these commands, here is a pretty cool guide about files that this CLI will generate for you. I'm going to click on TypeScript, and then here we'll quickly go through this. I would like you to read on your own because, I don't want to waste time in reading this. So some of the main files are this config folder. So config folder contains the configuration specific to your application. So you have three types of configuration when you generate application using CLI. So you got default.json or production.json. Then here's your source folder, which includes the folder like hooks and services. I'll show you what hook and services are. Then you got the middleware, which is like Express-based middleware. If you're coming from Express background, you're gonna feel very comfortable here. Here's a modal folders where all the models that will be generated by CLI will go into this folder. Here's your main app, which configures the feeders application. Next, we got this index.ts, which basically loads everything and starts the application. It's like your server entry point. It's a test folder for your tests. Then you also have this authentication file that I want to talk about. So this has a configuration for setting up authentication. Now in feeders.js, authentication code is not available directly in this application. There is another package. So if I take you to GitHub of feeders, you go to packages, and here we got four packages here. So authentication client, which is a front-end client written in feeders. You got local OAuth and authentication. So it's a core one. And then local, if you want to use username and password. Then if you want to go with Google, Twitter, Facebook, or any other OAuth, you will use this package. Now this is automatically set up for us. So we'll go back to the code. Now let's take a look at the TypeScript configuration. Here's a very minimum configuration comes with this setup. Then you got to go to config, default, JSON, and here I will talk about some of the configuration here. So here's your port in case you want to change the port that you are running your server. Here's a default configuration for authentication. So entity user, service users, then the secret. You might want to change this secret before you actually take your application to production. You got strategies for your auth, so it's JWT and local. Here's your local configuration for your authentication. So username field is set to email. You can modify that as a username if you want, and then the password field. Then here's your OAuth configuration. I selected GitHub. So what you need to do is go to GitHub, create a key and secret for you. Then you'll be able to use OAuth as well. Configuration for MongoDB that I specified, it's here. Next, we are going to take a look at source folder. So index.js, actually index.ts is your entry point. For example, here you see the servers is starting. Next file we'll take a look at is app.ts file. This is your configuration file for all the modules. For example, here we're using cores, we're using express.json, we are using this express.static to serve the static files like this index.html file. Then you got this socket IO configuration, then the Mongos that we selected. We got authentication configuration, and then channels for real-time events. We got this express.notfound, so for creating some middleware errors like 404. This file basically grabs all the modules and configure your application. So index.ts file can actually start. So logger configurations here, Mongo's connection that's happening is here. Then you got this declaration, which is specific to TypeScript. You won't see this file if you create an application using JavaScript. So it's basically going to export this express feeders with this service types generics, and that's coming from this feathers.js/express. So this is the application instance that you can refer to. Next, we are going to take a look at this service folder. Now, we initially created this user service. It has 3 files. It's got user class, hooks, and service. And then this index.ts file is basically just configuring all your services. Now we go to model. Here your model. In this case, we got this authentication model for a user. Like we got this email and a password and a GitHub ID. The timestamps are true by default. This is specific to Mongoose. So if you add this timestamps true, it will automatically add created, add and updated add fields to your database. We got some middlewares. So right now there is no middleware, but if there's anything you want to write, they'll go into this folder. Now it's time for us to run some scripts. So if you go to package.json file, here you got scripts. So you can test your application, you can lint it. You can start with dev mode, where you will change files in TypeScript and it will compile down to JavaScript and also make the code change. So start will compile and then it will serve with node. So if you change any file, it's not going to reload the server. So when you're developing, you got to use this dev script. You got this compile script, which will just compile the application into the lib folder. Mocha is going to do some testing for you. Now let's take a look at some of the dependencies. So here you see that we got a lot of feeders packages installed, like authentication, local authentication, auth, configuration, errors, express. So there's a lot of things coming from feeders. We got this common cores module where we can configure cores. You got this feeders-mongoose. That's because we use the mongoose as a database adapter, and feeder has its own mongoose adapter. Some more dependencies that you can take a look at them. Then we got some dev dependency. You can take a look at them as well if you want to. TypeScript version we're using is 4.7.3. At the time of this recording, it's the latest version. All right, and that's about it. Now let's go and run some scripts. So I will make the terminal a little bigger and I'll just npm run dev. Once I do that, you will see our server will start at localhost 3030. Now I'm going to open a new terminal, and in this case, I'm going to use the Cli command to actually test the login and the registration. But before we do that, let me quickly go back to the previous terminal and then kill it, and then make sure that my tests are passing. So all that stuff passing, which is good, and we can basically make sure that every time we change any code, we'll write the test for it as well. As I mentioned at the start of this video that feathers.js brings the authentication out of the box. So let's go and test that. You can either use Postman to test that, or you can use this Tender client in VS Code. So I'll just use this new request, and I'm going to be using localhost 3030. Before we can hit this URL, we got to make sure we will start our server. So I'll use the npm debug command from VS Code command palette, and we use the dev script. Now at this stage, our code should be running, and I'm going to change this HTTPS to HTTP and then send. Now when I send it, you see the response. It's because we have this index.html that is basically being served. So if I open Edge and I go to localhost 3030, enter, you'll see our server is serving this feeders index file. Let's go back to VS Code. Now, next thing we need to know, how do we test our authentication? Well, we're going to go to documentation, and here's a good guide about authentication. So click on that, and here it talks about how do you register user. So what you need to do is send a post request to /users with email and password. We can actually try out in code, but let's go back to VS Code and then create this users and then change the request to post. We go to body, and then in the body, I am going to be using a JSON, and we'll need to have email. I'll just use this test@gmail.com, and then we're gonna need a password, and I'll use this test password. Okay, let's go and try this out. I'm gonna send a request, and I get the response back, email ID, created ad, updated ad. Cool, so we can actually register users now. Now let's go back to Tender Client, and I'm gonna be creating a new request. I'll go back to this one, and I'll just copy this URL and then create a new request. I can actually save that request, and this is going to be another post request to log in. Let's go to body. I'm going to paste the body here. That would be email and a password again. We'll go to documentation, and here it talks about how do you receive a token. Basically, you're going to have to log in with your email and a password, but you're going to also specify that strategy. So I'll just copy this bit here, and then I'll just paste it on the top. Okay. Now let's click on send, and once I do that, it says email value already exists. So what am I doing wrong? Well, the URL that we're sending it's basically have the same path. So we try to register again. So let's go back to documentation, and then here it talks about what is the URL that you're gonna hit. So that's /authentication. So I'm gonna copy that and then paste it here. Then we can send it, and there we go. So we got the response now with access token. It also includes the information for a user. It also includes some information about the domain, and then, you know, some of the information that can be useful. But for now, all we're interested in access token. I'm going to copy this access token, and we're going to create a new request. And this time, well, let's go back and then just copy this, and we'll go to new request and then paste it here. I'll save the request and then go to auth, and then here you got barrier, and then I'm going to paste the token there. So the token would be in my clipboard. That's the one. I will just paste it here. Now save the request. Now we got this token. It's not going to expire because we haven't specified the expiry yet. So next thing, we are going to use another URL to get the details for us. So let's go to this users / and then I'm going to grab the ID. So we go here, and my ID for the user is this. Okay. Let's go to new request and then paste the ID and then send it. And then you get to see that once you specify the ID, you can actually query your data by just sending this users. Now, if I go to another user, and we will change the email to, let's say, test2, and then make another request to create another user. And we go to this get ID, and then I'm going to send it, and you get to see that we are receiving the information about. So we are going to create another model, and then we create a service, hooks, and class for that. So we're going to be using CLI for that. I'm going to kill the server, and I'm going to make a little bit bigger, and then we'll use feeders CLI, generate, and I would like to generate a service first. Okay, and that service is going to be using Mongoose again, and the service name is going to be, for example, quiz. Okay, we just create a quiz, enter, and then the path that we want to register, we just use that quiz. And I'm going to use the authentication. So this way, basically, I'm telling it to do not let anybody to talk to the data or grab the data without authenticated user. So why? And then it's going to modify these files for us. So let's take a look at what has been modified. So now you can see in the services, you got the quiz, class, quiz hook, quiz service. Then you got index.ts. It's already configured the quiz, so which is good. Next, we take a look at the model. It's already been created for us, and you can actually modify this model as well. So I'm going to add another key here, and I'm going to make that true. So I want this text to be unique. Okay. Now let's go and start our server, and let's try hitting the quiz. So I'm gonna run this debug dev. Once we have that running, then I'm gonna go to Tender Client, and I'm gonna copy this request and then paste that. Would be copy and then paste. Nope, it does not do that. So what I'll have to do is just, write a new request. This one, let's close some of the files. Okay, our server is running now. I'm gonna go to click on new request, and then here HTTP localhost 3030/quiz. Okay, let's click on send, and it says not authenticated. So as you can see, we can't get the quiz data. Why is that? If we go to our services, go to quiz and go to hook, and here there is a hook built in feeders that says, you got to make sure that you authenticate the user with JWT to be able to get the data. So this is basically blocking it. Now let's go and log in user. I'm gonna go to another request, which is authenticate this login, send. It says method not allowed. So we'll probably have to, actually, yes, we need this token. So copy that token, go to quiz, go to auth, go to bearer, and then paste that token there, and then send the request. And now you get to see you got responses total 0, limit 10, and skip 0. So we don't have any data. So what I'm going to do now is, let's save this, and we're going to create a quiz. So if I can duplicate this by any chance, I cannot. So I'll just copy this URL, create a new request, and then paste it here. It's going to be a post request. And then we're going to make sure we have auth, and then the token is pasted, so we can validate that we are like authenticated user. Now let's go to body, and here I'm going to use the JSON, and this is going to be test, and let's say it's going to be my custom quiz. Let's save it, and then we're going to send that request. Now it says quiz validation failed, test part test is required. So it says text is required, and I made a typo here, test. So we got to change this to text and then send it, and you get to see we got one quiz added. Now let's go back to the main this get call and then send again, and now you get to see the response coming back with a data is an array and then one object. Okay. Now this is cool, but let's say if we try to create a quiz without authentication, we'll just say none, and then try to send it. It says not authenticated. So now you can see by just adding one thing to your hook, it's just not allowing anybody unauthorized to create a quiz. Now, this is a brief introduction of Feeders.js and how you can use CLI. We're going to be explaining some hooks and services in a second. So feeders and generate command --help will tell you what it can do for you. So here you can generate a new application that we use to generate. The authentication will set up authentication for our current application. So if you haven't set up your authentication, when you created the application, you can use this authentication command to set it up. Connection, it initializes a new connection to a database and configures your application automatically. If you want to create a hook, you use the hook command. middleware, you create a middleware service and a plugin. What is a service in Feathers.js? So here's the official documentation which explains what is a service. I won't go and read everything here, but I will basically quickly show you some points. So service is basically a class you create with some helper function. It can do reading and writing from a database, interacting with the file system, or calling the API, or call other services like sending email, processing payment, or returning the current weather of your location. It's a class which has some helper functions that you can write to do certain things. Now you can also use service methods. So when you create a service and extend your class with the feeders provided service, it automatically brings in these functions like find, get, create, update, patch, and remove. Now you remember we created this service here, a quiz service, and if you look at the file, it really doesn't have much. It's declaring the module. This is like a TypeScript convention here. Now it has a function that is just creating a new service with this quiz class. And if you look at the class, it has pretty much nothing, except it is extending this service here. And this service is coming from Feathers Mongo package, which brings the CRUD operation automatically. So if I zoom in and go to this service, you will see it extends the adapter service. Let's go in there. And then within the adapter service, you will find this function like find, get, create, update, patch, and remove. So you see, you don't really have to add your CRUD operations within your class. It automatically comes out of the box when you extend your class with this service. Now let's go back to a service. So service, all it's doing, it's using this quiz class and creating a new instance of it, and it's naming it as quiz. It also configuring the hook for us. So a service.hooks will configure hooks. We'll get to hooks, but let's understand service now. Official documentation is telling us a service is actually a class, right? It's a class or an object. And in JavaScript, everything is an object like function and classes, and in the background, it's basically an object. So if we take a look at what's happening here, it's just basically an object here, which is configuring the service using this quiz class and then configuring hooks using this quiz file. So pretty simple stuff here. Let's go back to official documentation. We already know that how this method will be available for us. Here's a JavaScript version of a class or a TypeScript version of class or object. So we're using TypeScript. All we're doing is just importing this from Feathers.js, having a class which implements the service, and it automatically brings this function. Now before we move on, I'm going to go back to this class file. And here you see in the constructor function, we are passing super options. And options are basically type of Mongo service options. So your actual model that you're creating here. So if you look at the model folder, you got this quiz.model. Basically, this model is an instance of a document from Mongoose, which get passed into your class, and then because you need to tell the functions that are coming from this service that this is the model that you are going to be using, right? So this is happening here. So we know what the model is, basically just a model from Mongoose, and that's about it. And in TypeScript, it's a little complicated, but if you use JavaScript, it's going to be a lot simpler, okay? Now let's take a look at something else in documentation. Here is an event. Now, if you go down, we got service events. You can actually listen for events from service when something is created or updated or patched or removed. And the way you use events is by using this service.on and then specify the name of the method that you're going to listen for, added D at the end, and then you can use this dot then, or use a callback to listen for it. And here's an example for that. So app.service.on created, and then you got dot then, and then basically it's a promise, so you can just do any operation on this. Here it talks about database adapters, and in our case we use this mongoose adapter, feeders-mongoose. So if you use that adapter, it will automatically configure that for you. We already know how we generate a service and what options it asks, which is pretty cool. And now it talks about how do you customize your service. It's not something that we're going to do right now, but just go through this documentation and then you will know how do you extend. It's not about feeders, yes, but it's about TypeScript or JavaScript, how you extend classes. That's pretty much it is. Now that's about it for services. I hope you understood, but let's go to hooks. Hooks are very common in a lot of frameworks. So hooks are basically applying functions that allows you to perform operation on specific things. Or let's say you want to do something before somebody goes and add a quiz. You want to do something after the quiz is created, or you want to do something when there is an error. So if you look at services, quiz, and then go to hook, all it's basically doing is like before is something that you will do before this operation gets triggered. So let's say somebody creates a new case, then you want to do something, then what you do is you'll just create a function like, I'm going to use this pre-create, and then we use this context, and then just use the context data, and then I'm just going to be grabbing the user from params, and then its ID, a name, and then the email, and then what I can do is just return the context. Okay, so function must return the context, what you pass in. Now to be able to use this, all you gotta do is just add this as pre-create, call that function, and basically this will be called before quiz is created. So if our server is running, let's go kill this terminal, and I'm going to use debug npm, and I'm going to do a breakpoint here, okay, and maybe breakpoint there as well. So our server is running, we'll go to Thunder client, and here I was creating a quiz, right? We'll go to body, and I'm going to change this because this is supposed to be unique. I'll click on send. Once it's sent, it says not authorized. So we go to auth, go to bearer, and that's the token that we're going to be using. Let's send the request. Once I send it, you'll see this pre-create is triggering, and then we are basically, running this function before we create that. So hooks are pretty common, and in the before key, you can specify any amount of functions for these CRUD operations. After, basically, if you specify some functions after, it will just run that function after the quiz is created. So before and after, and you can specify a function on any operation like create, update, patch, remove. You can also deal with errors. Well, let's say you are creating a new quiz, but there is an error. You can actually pass an error handler here, which will be triggered if there is an error on that specific operation. So it's a really good way of error handling. If you want to do some custom error handling, you can do it here, and you can separate out if you want to do something different for get or create or update, you can do it here as well. Now, models are pretty simple. You can read about this in the Mongoose, how you have to specify the model. So if I go to the documentation of Mongoose JS, you can go to read the docs, go to model, and here it talks about how you specify the model. So it's using this mongoose.schema, and if you can look at our code, it's basically doing the same thing. It's using Mongo client.schema. So Mongo client, think of this Mongo client as just Mongoose. Now you can read all about Mongoose here if you're planning to use Mongoose, but I'm not gonna go into details of this because it's out of the scope of this video. And after you read the Mongoose or any database adapter and you get to read its documentation, you can see what are the options available for you. Right, so next we go back to feeders documentation. Here you can take a look at some more things. For example, this context of hook. So hook will take a context as a param, and you will get all these options within that context parameter. So just explain a little bit more, if we go back to quiz hook, here we create this pre-create, and then we pass the function with this context param, and this context param has these values available. Some of them are read-only. For example, the app is going to be read-only, service, path, method type, read-only. There are writable properties as well. For example, context of param, query, provider, ID, data, error, results, right? It talks about how you can register hook. So in TypeScript, you specify the hook like this, and you can register them by using service.hook function. That's about it. It's pretty straightforward, guys. Now we covered services, hooks, and these are like most main concepts, but let's go to APIs. In this API section, you can find what's available for you on application, service, hook. So these are all the functions available. Use, service, hook. You can read about them, what these functions do for you. For example, if you want to add a path, which will be your endpoint, you can use this use function. If you want to register a service, you can use this .service to specify its path. Then you also have this .hook to configure the hook for your service. You can also use this listen function to start your server, and we're already using that. If you look at index.ts file, let's go to index.ts file. So here we're using this app.listen. Back to documentation. So go ahead and then read about what's available for application. Same for services. These are the methods available in services. I'll just quickly show you how you can override them. Now let's go down. Here you can see what's available in the param. So let's go down a little bit here. Get, create, it talks about what are the params available, what are the parameters available for this get function or create function or all other CRUD operations. So take a look at those. Now let's quickly go back to your code and I'll show you how you can override those functions. So for example, here's my service. We're going to go to actually class, okay? Now let's say this service already provides the get method. And if I go to Thunder client and I'll go to this get and then send it, and you can see we're getting all of this. So what we're calling is the find CRUD operation on this quiz. So if I go to my class and I'm going to say async function, which is going to be find, and for the type, because using TypeScript, so we can use this params from feeders. So here's the params you're going to import, and then return type, you can just say any. Okay, but right now, let's say we can use this return await this dot model dot find, and then from here I'm gonna just use this Mongoose and to object, which will return everything. So now it says object is possibly undefined. The reason why it's undefined, I think it's model. Yeah, return. Okay, I'm pretty sure this is model, but let's take a look at that. So if I go to service, we go to take a look at, so it's capital M, model type document. Okay, so I made a mistake here, guys. So we're just going to use this model. All right. Now you can specify its type any, but I'm gonna just not specify that. Now here it says find with lacks return annotation. We don't need this. Okay, cool. Now let's do a breakpoint here. Now previously when we were using this request, we really didn't have any place to do the breakpoint. If I send now, you'll see it goes to this find function and then finds the model, which basically get passed through these options to this super, which is this service. And if I let it go and take a look at it quiz, we get to see the data going back. Okay, so as you can see, we override the function, which is a find function within this, and you can now use your custom logic for that find function. So pretty cool stuff, guys. Now, same thing for hooks. You can see what's available for you in the context. If I go down a bit, you got this events. Take a look at it. I'm not going to go into this real-time stuff for this video. I'll have a separate video, but I'll show you how you can create a chat application. But this is a pretty easy to use framework, and I was able to create API very quickly with the help of CLI. Right, so next we already took a look at how the authentication can be set up very easily. But if you're interested in looking at OAuth, here's a guide for that. The way you can configure GitHub or Twitter or Facebook using OAuth, right? So take a look at this guide. I'll use a separate video. I'll actually create a separate video for this guide. Now we also have this database section. You can take a look at common API, what's available for you to do the query. And I'll have a separate video for how you can do a query within Mongoose and Feeders.js, because that requires a lot of explanation. But for now, you can take a look at the query guide if you are interested in on your own. So that's about it, and we were able to create a full API using some commands. I didn't really have to write any functions or code. You can see how easy it is. So another thing before we end this video, I'll go to this ecosystem. Here you can click on this awesome feeder. Here's a list of great resources regarding Feeders.js. For example, if you want to use Angular as a front end, you can click on Angular and then it'll show you, here's a package that's basically demonstrating how you can use Angular with this Feeders.js using this live query streams for feeders. Okay, here's a repository for React admin. So if I click on this, it's a pretty good project. I've actually cloned it, tried it. It's really good in terms of, you know, how it's built using this Feeder.js and React with real-time data flowing from backend to front end. Take a look at this, how this is done. Pretty great stuff, guys. Now, that's about it for this video, guys, and I hope you liked this quick introduction. And after watching this video, you should be able to build APIs, including authentication and models. Should be just easy. All you gotta know is modifying your models. So here's a model, add more key value pairs to this schema, and that's it. Okay, hope you liked the video. Subscribe to the channel if you liked the video, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Cheers.